and welcome. I'm Dr. Sushil Perez, and today we will be discussing your student teaching assignment in an urban classroom and some of the expectations that you can have and responsibilities that you can look forward to before the student teaching assignment begins. I have been a student teacher supervisor for the past 4 years, and as a high school teacher, also hosted many student teachers such as yourselves. And I hope that sharing some of these experiences with you today and the expectations that we have of you will make this student teaching experiences more meaningful for you and for your students. Before we begin, I'd like you to think about and ultimately write down some of your feelings about your own school experiences. So first, I'd like you to think about your favorite teacher and your favorite classroom. What made it your favorite classroom? How did you feel in that classroom as a learner? How were your needs met or not? And then I'd like you to think about a not so favorite teacher and learning environment. Do you feel your needs were met as a learner? And if not, then try to describe why you think that was so. And think about the experience, how you felt. Now that I've given you something to ponder, I'd really like you to pause this video and actually fill out this T-chart for yourself. We will definitely come back to this T-chart at the end of the video so that you can compare what you thought were the best and worst with culturally responsive instruction, which I think is key to making sure that your student teaching experience in an urban setting is meaningful and is positive for both you and your students. So again, if you could pause the video and just jot down those best and worst experiences, then once you're finished with that, go ahead and return. Now that you've given it this idea of worst and best teaching characteristics some thought and jotted down your ideas, I'd like you to think about the new challenges that you face as a teacher, both challenges and possibilities. When we consider student teaching and new teachers in general, we have to realize that we're kind of faced with unprecedented responsibilities. Not only are we expected to teach at a higher standard, but we're also expected to teach to an increasingly changing population of students, one that is becoming more ethnically and racially diverse. So 40% of the students that you will meet belong to racial ethnic minorities. 25% live in poverty. And 10 to 20% of the students you will meet are served in special education classrooms. So why is your student teaching experience in an urban classroom so important? First of all, student teaching experiences have been a staple of education programs probably since the time that we have teachers or that we've had teachers. They vary in length and they vary in intensity, but it's always part of a teacher education program because research has shown that it is the most important component of teacher education training. It serves to bridge that gap between what we have been teaching you in a teacher education program and what you can really experience in the classroom. But some have also referred to the student teaching experience as a survival period. And that's because not only are you in the classroom in a teaching position for the first time, but you're there to uphold the tenets of your student-teacher training, and you're also there with another teacher in the room. So as a student teacher, you have to navigate these two worlds. And most importantly, you have students that are looking up to you and that are expecting to learn from your student teaching experience. And research has also shown that there's a huge connection between the student teaching experience and consequent success as a teacher, meaning that The more positive experience you have while student teaching, and the more your students learn from you, the better teacher you will be once you finish the program. So now I'd like us to watch a video that gives voice to these future students in your classroom. As you watch this video, think about the discrepancies the student is discussing and how the power struggle he describes might be avoided.
I think that the main differences in races are just culture, and it's a clear cultural difference. White folks and black folks are different, period. We operate differently culturally. I guess I shouldn't say we're different, period, but culturally we're very different. And what goes on in the white community, pointing fingers in people's face and stuff like that might be fine, but you don't point a finger in a black kid's face. It's a confrontation immediately. Teachers don't know that, You take your hat off. Like, what? You pointing at me? Like, it's an immediate, and a lot of times kids, it might not even boil down to the finger pointing, but, if you're raised in an urban environment, like, you have to know how to survive so you're not backing down quick. So every little thing becomes a power struggle. Every little thing becomes an issue. And when you're dealing with people who live in communities that are powerless, the kids need to feel empowered some way. So if it just means that I pissed the teacher off today, I won today. Today I was powerful. Mr. So-and-so or Miss So-and-so is pissed off, and I did that,
Okay, now that we've watched that video and you've heard from that student, it's important for us to understand, I think, what the discrepancy he is alluding to, the consequences that can have in your future classroom, in both your student teaching environment and as a professional just about to enter the field. I think that we can all see by what he says in the video that that power struggle could have been avoided, and that perhaps there was a cultural mismatch between the teacher in the room and the student. And most likely, that teacher in the room hadn't set up expectations of behavior and norms in her classroom, so that when this student walks in with a hat or a cap, he doesn't know what to expect. He hasn't been told that that's not something that is acceptable here. There hasn't been any explicit discussion, and more importantly, there certainly doesn't seem to have been like a real dialogue between the teacher and her students. So before you embark on your student teaching experience, we'll discuss today some culturally responsive instruction practices that will hopefully allow you to avoid that cultural discontinuity that the student is alluding to. What we know from cultural mismatch research is that student achievement has been and is negatively impacted by that type of discontinuity. And as you could see on the video, if a student feels that there has to be a power struggle in the room, and he feels that he has to win in that power struggle because the rest of the time he felt powerless in that room, then it's obvious that this is not going to lead to his learning. Research has also established that both pre-service teachers of color and white pre-service teachers need more instruction on culturally relevant pedagogy and culturally responsive practices. And that's what we'll discuss today. As we discuss culturally responsive instruction and your student teaching assignment, it's important that we think about that all teachers are change agents, whether new teachers or veteran teachers. Part of our responsibility in an urban classroom and with underserved students is to make sure that our teaching leads to more equitable opportunities for these students. So teachers must think of themselves as change agents who will teach in ways that are culturally responsive instruction and that create model classrooms where students feel validated and valued. What's also important here is that student teachers are change agents and learners. And important to consider when we discuss yourself as a change agent and a learner is to ensure that you don't fall into what Feynman and Nemser and Buchanan have termed the two worlds pitfall. And one way to ensure that you don't do that is to be a proactive learner within that student teaching experience. So the two world pitfalls basically means that in research and in student education, we understand that you guys are kind of really between a rock and a hard place. You're in someone else's classroom, but you'll be teaching in that classroom for a semester, perhaps 2 semesters, and you're trying to bridge those theoretical tenets that we have been discussing with you in classes in your student teacher training. But you're still in that other person's classroom. So how to make sure that you are engaging the students in the classroom by being culturally responsive, but that you too are considering your own needs as a learner. And part of that has, again, to do with dialogue and making sure that you speak to your clinical teacher in the room and that both of you agree on when it would be a good time for you to take over classes, and that you haven't taken over so many classes that it does not give you a chance to be a reflective practitioner. So that when you embark on your student teacher and student teaching experience, and when you actually begin to teach lessons, you've given your time, and the teacher in the room has given you time to reflect on those lessons. Think about how they were received, whether everyone was engaged, or what you would have done differently, and discuss those with your clinical teacher. Important to culturally responsive instruction and to the student teaching experience is the realization that motivation begins at the door. And keeping your students engaged is much more important to their achievement than is their intelligence. As we know from years of research, the teacher in the room is the most important factor on whether or not a student learns. And to ensure that students are learning in your classroom, it would be important for us to look at culturally responsive teaching and how that can work to mitigate differences between you and your students, and can also make your lessons more engaging. So we'll be looking at Latin Billings' 8 principles of culturally responsive teaching. And the first and most important principle, I think, is to make sure that your students understand that you're holding them to high expectations, but that you're going to do everything possible so that you can make or allow them to meet these high expectations. And in order to do so, you'll have to incorporate active teaching methods, which make you the facilitator in the room to your students' learning. It's important for you to be inclusive of all of your students. And the best way to do that is to be aware of culturally and linguistically diverse students in your classroom, but to be aware of all of your students, and to treat them with cultural sensitivity. Now, all of this generally boils down to your ability to reshape the curriculum and the delivery of services. We all know in student education that what we teach in the student teacher training is not necessarily what you're going to find in a public school setting, because there are pressures in a public school setting, such as the Common Core state standards. In Florida, it used to be the FCAT, and these pressures are very real in a teacher's life and in a student teaching experience. But as a teacher in the room and as a change agent, it is your job to make sure that you can reshape curriculum so that it meets the standards of expectations such as Common Core, but that it also meets the needs of your students. And part of that is making sure that you create lessons that are student controlled and that involve small group instruction. An example of that might include MLK and what we know about Martin Luther King and the way that the civil rights movements have traditionally been discussed in textbooks. And that is that a lot of the agency that Rosa Parks had and the civil rights leaders were deliberate about is sometimes not given credit in the canon. So, as an instructor that is being culturally responsive instruction and is meeting students' needs, it would be your job to make sure that that discourse becomes student-centered and that you reshape the curriculum so that that agency of the civil rights movement is something that is explicit and clear to your students. Because student minorities or students that belong to racially and ethnically diverse groups need to see that agency, and they need to understand the power behind such agency. As a culturally responsive teacher and a change agent, it will be very important for you to think about your lessons. How are you going to introduce them? How are you going to capture your students' interest? And how are you going to build background knowledge so that you're all communicating on the same page? And to do this, you should really work on creating a classroom learning community. And by that, we mean it is important for students to know that you care, and it is important for students to know that it's okay for them to care about themselves, that that's part of the expectation. And one way to do that is to design a classroom environment where students respond cognitively and emotionally to classroom aesthetics, meaning that the classroom is a place where they can see themselves. So if you have posters, it would behoove you to make sure that your students, whatever population it is that you're teaching, whether it happens to be very ethnically diverse, are represented in your classroom. And that your classroom becomes a safe haven for diversity and for all of your students. And make sure that you let your students know that the classroom space is theirs to create together as well. The most important, or one of the keys to making sure that your students are engaged and that they feel welcome and that they understand that that classroom is theirs to create, is that you hold high academic standards and expectations for all of your students. But that even more importantly, you really encourage all of your students to reach those standards and beyond. Treat them as if they are competent and developing. And foster this growth mindset. And that means designing lessons with your most underserved students in mind. Such lessons will make sure to deliver content to those students who have been most underserved and to the rest of your students as well. When we think about being culturally responsive and following culturally responsive practices, it's important to think about culture and the differences between culture as a big C, and that means the culture that all of us can belong to in the United States, or the culture that some minorities belong to, and really think about culture as a small c. So focus on your student culture and the idiosyncrasies of that classroom. And by that I mean that if you have Mexican students, that doesn't mean that 100% of Mexicans hit piñatas 100% of the time. You have to realize that there's more variance within groups than across groups. So key to that would be not to assume that because you're teaching to minority students that they're all going to have the same experiences. Part of being and becoming a culturally responsive teacher is to make sure that you understand your own cultural identity and its consequences. So examine your cultural behavior, especially when it comes to classroom management and discipline. Be yourself with your students, honest, caring, and human. If you can go back to that video that we saw, that kind of power struggle that student was referring to in the classroom can be completely avoided. And to do so, you really have to become aware of your cultural behavior patterns and what it is that you have accepted for yourself, and make sure that your students understand those expectations so that those things don't become an issue and they don't impede the learning in your classroom. Central to engagement is motivation. And one way to make sure that your students are motivated is to make sure that you're all on the same page. So build not just background knowledge based on students' experiences, but build everything around students' experiences, whether they've experienced it or not. Meaning that you create lessons that are building background knowledge, but that are also aware of the fact that not all students are going to have the same background knowledge. And the best way for them to experience learning is to make sure that they experience it with you in the classroom. And not that you assume that they would have already had these experiences before walking into your classroom. An important part of being culturally responsive is using practices that are research-based and that we know work. So today let's discuss 5 practices that work. The first one is relevance. And that's similar to what we discussed in terms of building background knowledge and making sure that students can experience learning with you. And one way to do that is to make it personal. Show them how whatever you're reading or whatever you're discussing or whatever history lesson you're talking about or science experiment you're conducting, it is personal to them. Help them connect to that. Also important would be to provide choices. They don't have to be big choices, small everyday choices. Whether it's choosing which character to talk about in a novel or which character to analyze, or whether that might include which history section of a chapter to follow. Also important is would be the fact that you allow for and build into your lessons partner activities and collaborative learning. And ensure that your students are successful, meaning that you hold high expectations and that you create a rigorous curriculum, but that in doing so, you also build in scaffolds so that students experience success in your classroom. And last but not least, help students understand the value of their reading and learning immediately. Don't be afraid of 21st century tools. On the contrary, use them. We know from research that whatever students read online, if given the choice, they would like to write about it immediately. So have them blog, have them read online, and teach them how to tweet, because that's going to make them more engaged. And they can see their own learning in progress. So some things to consider as you plan and embark on your student teaching experience would be using visuals to make content comprehensible. Thinking about how you're going to create lessons where students are actually expected to apply new learning and not just expected to remember and then later be tested. Another thing to consider is ensure that students have multiple opportunities to practice new learning and then apply it. And think to yourself how you will provide closure to presentations. An example of that would be a circuit of knowledge, where you have groups of students who are expected to present and collaborate with each other, so that now you've taken them through the whole learning process. You've given them opportunities to practice, multiple opportunities to learn and be engaged. You've given them an opportunity to apply that learning, and then you can also give them an opportunity to work on that new application together, so that the end result is a group presentation. Now I would like you to revisit that best-worst characteristics chart, which you filled out at the beginning of the module. Look at the best and the worst characteristics and see how they may be the same or different from culturally responsive instruction. I think you'll find that some of those worst characteristics probably do not align with culturally responsive instructions. If those experiences were negative for you, more than likely that teacher in the room was not validating you as a student, and therefore was not providing you the best possible learning environment. And now think about how these new findings can impact you as a student teacher, and how you will embark on this new part of your career. Thank you for your time and your attention. I am convinced that you will have a very successful student teaching experience and that both you and your students will gain and learn a great deal.